I came into Wyandotte thinking I was going to change these kids' lives with literature. So I had Shakespeare on the brain, and I had Emerson and Thoreau on the brain, and all these classics like Ray Bradbury and Nathaniel Hawthorne and The Scarlet Letter, and all these things that I had read growing up. And I quickly realized that these kids didn't share the same passion that I did for literature. And I think there's a huge shift going on in education, that it's so much more than just reading classic text.
I'm Nathaniel Bozarth, and this is Wide Ruled, Brainroot's podcast on the past, present, and future of education in America. On Wide Ruled, you'll join me as I delve into the depths of the tortuous identity of our education system. How did we get here? Where exactly is here? And where are we going? On today's pilot episode, we'll hear from Brian DeLiesel, teacher leader in Kansas City, Kansas. That's KCK. Not to be confused with Casey Mo, Kansas City, Missouri, located just across State Line Road. You'll hear Brian talk specifically about Wyandotte High School, which is composed of 95% economically disadvantaged students. Brian tells the story of how exactly he came to think that something in American education needs to change, and what he's doing to affect that change.
So you said it took a couple years for you to sort of start to realize you're beating a dead horse. Was there a specific moment that really transformed you from content-based education?
I had a student, and I won't say his name.
To keep things simple, we'll call him John.
But my very first day of teaching, this kid walked into the room, and he circled me, and he stared me up and down. And it was one of those moments, as a first-year teacher, you're on the outside going, stay cool, stay calm, don't look intimidated. But inside, you're freaking out because you're like, this kid could kick my butt, you know? And what I realized is this kid was just a pain, man. And I realized that he had more power than I did in the classroom. And I finally, about halfway through the year, I pulled him aside and just acknowledged it. And I was like, hey, kid, like, you have just as much power, if not more, in this class than I do. So we've got to find some common ground. And I remember him looking at me and saying, you know, Mr. DeLiesel, you know why I hate your class? And I go, please tell me, like, let's find some middle ground here. And he goes, it's because you call on me constantly. You're always asking me to do things, and I can't freaking read. A 12th grader had faked his way through an educational system, could not read, and I had no idea. Even as an English teacher, halfway through a year, I didn't know that one of my kids couldn't read.
Like couldn't read, as in couldn't, like had a different, was a slow reader or was dyslexic or what? How bad was that?
Struggled with decoding and did not comprehend.
Okay, teacher speak, decoding. Well, I have no idea what that means.
That's the ability to sound out words, to pronounce words. So when you're reading, you know what the word means and you say it. But even when he could decode, I would ask him, what did you read there? He couldn't tell me. And I remember telling him, like, I am here after school every day till 3:30 and beyond if you ever need me. I think John showed up once, and he never really did come back. And he ended up dropping out. I think almost towards the end of the year, there wasn't a chance he was going to graduate, so he stopped coming to school. We never saw him again. And then I remember 5 years later, I believe, and my timing might be a little off, I was sitting at district convocation. I got a text from my friend who had read a news story that morning that he had been killed in a drive-by.
So that's what's at stake. John didn't really have what he needed to get a legitimate job, so he probably got an illegitimate job pushing drugs or prescription meds, got in with a rough crowd, and got into trouble. Schooling has been touted at times as the panacea of our country's ills or as the great socioeconomic equalizer. It supposedly has the power to raise kids like John up out of poverty, or, as was the case, not.
So that right there, I mean, I just kind of sat stunned because I knew that John left school with a very low ceiling. I mean, what can you do if you leave school not being able to read and write. Your opportunities are so limited. And he took some wrong turns. We're going to run into kids like this on a consistent basis. And traditional education, reading the canon, reading texts that are way above their head and have very little connection to them, isn't going to work with kids like him. So, yeah, I think that changed the way I viewed education and as a teacher. So I definitely started seeking out texts that would relate to my kids, but then kind of focused in on it. It really wasn't about the text. It was the meanings and the understandings that came from the text. And how do I teach kids to come to their own understandings through text and not just mine?
John's death sucks, but at least it hasn't gone without impact. Brian believes that he could have done something to prevent that drive-by from ever happening by engaging John in class and giving him the tools that he needed to succeed. That belief has launched him into a relentless search for a better way. This is a huge change from when Brian first started teaching, when really teaching was just a side gig so that he could coach high school football. So after Brian and I discussed this major turn in his career, we turned towards policy and the Common Core standards. I went online to corestandards.org to try to understand exactly what is Common Core. In short, it's a set of expectations for what children should learn at each grade level in English language arts and mathematics. In 2010, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers released the standards to be adopted on a state-by-state basis. Now, in 2016, all but 8 states have adopted Common Core, which is really good if you're the creators of Common Core, because the stated goal is to create a sort of level playing field so that you can get the same skills, same level of education, the same preparation for career or college, no matter what state you live in. Though Common Core does prescribe what skills students should learn, they do not, however, dictate how teachers teach those skills. Here's Brian again.
I've always said it's really not the standards that are the problem. It's what we do with standards. So the standardized testing, I think, is a huge issue and a misuse of standards. I think some of the curriculum that's produced and pushed out really kind of bastardizes the standards. But if you look at the Common Core standards in and of themselves, they are what good readers, writers, speakers, and users of language do. So I think when you take a focus in on the skill sets that you have to teach kids, it really no longer becomes primarily about content. It's regardless of what content you're studying, can kids deeply read a piece of text? Can they deeply write about a piece of text? And can they deeply speak about it? And I think those 3 pillars are the cornerstone of English language arts. And the text and the literature and the units are important, but almost secondary to that. We've got to carve out space in education for kids to find their own voice and to find their own passions. And I think that once kids do that, then we can start teaching these deep reading, deep writing, deep speaking skills within a context that they're highly engaged in.
As Brian talked about deep literacy skills, it reminded me of something Neil Postman and Charles Weingartner wrote back in 1969. Crap detecting. Postman and Weingartner touted this singular ability as the most essential skill that schools must teach children. And basically, crap detecting is just a much more interesting name for critical thinking. But think about this. In 1969, the U.S. was in upheaval over the Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, and the Beatles. People were thinking quite critically of authority and existing systems. Yet, according to Postman, this skill was yet lacking in students. Now, in the 21st century, we still have authority that needs questioned, but we also have Zuckerberg's Facebook and the Google ad machine to infinitely curate content into mental massage that always biases towards what we already believe. Crap detecting, deep skills, or critical thinking, whatever you want to call it, amidst this ensuing media isolation, is more important than ever.
It happened last year. Michelle McLean, she was at Schlegel, and she had this 12th grade English class, and she was getting nowhere with them, and she was beating her head against the wall. So she stumbled across this idea of Genius Hour, which Genius Hour kind of came out of Google and Google Fridays, where 20% of an employee's time can be used to explore whatever avenue they wanted to, as long as it served the company. So Google saw some innovation come from that, and that model kind of got some traction in certain areas, and it got some traction in education, so they call it Genius Hours.
So in Michelle McLean's class, students have 1 hour a week all semester to research whatever they want. Some of them may choose to study cats, or some may choose to study chicken nuggets, and that's totally okay. At the end of the semester, they give a presentation to the class about whatever they decided to research.
But there was one student in particular, and her name was Cheyenne, and she was a very disengaged 12th grader. And her research question was, what's wrong with the world and how do we change it? And that's a huge question, and she knew it. And she did some kind of, I would say, untraditional ways of researching. I don't know how you necessarily research that question. So she threw the question out on Facebook and social media sites, and got some responses from her friends. But in her research, she stumbled upon this story called the Golden Gate Bridge Project. I don't know if you're familiar about it. I don't know if the story's true. However, it's a powerful story. So this student shared this story around this guy woke up and walked to the Golden Gate Bridge one morning and jumped off and killed himself. So the authorities found the body, found out who it was, and went back to his house. And what they found was a note. It was a suicide note. And the suicide note had said, I'm going to walk to the Golden Gate Bridge today, and I'm going to jump off. If one person acknowledges me as I'm walking to the bridge, I will turn around and come home. Not one person acknowledged him. So I'm sitting in the back of this room, and I'm listening to this student's story, and the revelation that she came to was, you don't have to do anything grand to change the world. Kindness can change the world. And this student had me in tears. I'm in the back of the room, 38-year-old man in a senior English presentation, and I've got tears going down my cheeks.
And just to hear this again, you said she was a disengaged 12th grader.
Yes.
That doesn't sound like the story of a disengaged 12th grader. So there was a transformation.
She wasn't the only one. She had more students than that who came into her class just kind of whatever, going through the motions, to all of a sudden highly engaged and really kind of forming a community. And what I watched after this student gave this presentation was almost like a rallying around this student. Like, I had no idea that you had been homeless. Like, I had no idea about your story. So the power of students being able even to share their stories with their peers in a very safe place cannot be underestimated.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that Cheyenne had been homeless on and off throughout her childhood. And she said that through this project, she had discovered her calling in life. She wanted to become a teacher, just like Michelle McLean and Brian DeLiesel, being a voice of kindness for children who, like herself, hadn't experienced much.
So what I believe in is that teachers have to take their profession back. Politicians, policymakers,
And perhaps the National Governors Association, like we talked about earlier,
have kind of forced what education should look like, and what we should be held accountable for. So what I do know is the most powerful reform that I've ever seen happen doesn't come from any particular model that's pushed onto teachers or pushed onto a system. It's one that's created by teachers through the culture of a school.
In efforts to create such a culture towards tailor-made reform and innovation, Brian started meeting regularly with a group of teachers interested in reform in spring of 2016. He calls the group Grassroots.
So the idea behind this group, it kind of started with the screening Most Likely to Succeed that was produced by Ted Dintersmith and Tony Wagner. This idea that, so the screening focused pretty much exclusively on High Tech High, which is a school that's done some amazing things. And it's a very inspiring film, but here's what I know, that we can't tomorrow go up to a school and turn it into a High Tech High.
The High Tech High he's talking about is located in San Diego, California. The school, a part of a network of 13 similar schools in San Diego County, was founded in 2000 to support a different kind of education where classes are not compartmentalized into subjects like math, biology, art, etc. And each semester, students spend all of their time developing some project which they then present or display for the community every May or December.
So how do we impact change? And what does it look like when teachers impact change? So the grassroots group is kind of a network of teachers who are starting to meet on a more frequent basis to start dreaming about what education could look like. I think if you've been in education for 15, 16 years, I think one of the constraints you see is the fact that lots of things come and go. So we'll be hot on this one topic then, and then all of a sudden it'll disappear and another thing will replace it. So what you see is this ebb and flow of these different visions and ideas that are done unto teachers. And I think that can get extremely discouraging because let's say you buy into this initiative, this curriculum approach, this idea, this structure, and then all of a sudden it's gone and something's replaced it, and now you have to buy into this new program or this new approach. And let's say you've experienced that 4 or 5 times or not more in your career. I think there's a healthy dose of skepticism there, and that skepticism isn't unwarranted.
To fight that healthy skepticism, Grassroots has instituted a no, yeah, but policy. That is, if teacher A suggests some idea that might help her students become more engaged, teacher B, or teacher A for that matter, is not allowed to say, yeah, but, and cite a list of reasons why it won't work. It's like that improv rule when you're acting and your fellow actor says something crazy, you go along with it, rather than denying the validity of their assertion or whatever direction they may want to take the skit. So you may have a crazy idea, but if you let yourself believe that it's possible, you just might be able to creatively make it work within the overlording system, regardless and in spite of what constraints that system may present.
The idea is that the system, the district, doesn't push down this mandate of this school will reform and change, but the district now supports kind of from the side. And I think that's important because I think teachers are fed up with being done unto. They want to do and they want to dream, and quite frankly they're the ones in the classroom. So I mean, they have to have that say. They have that one-on-one experience with kids, and no one knows those kids better than those teachers.
Brian says that teachers need to take back their profession. It starts to sound like a Marxist movement where the proletariat rising up is the teachers who are taking back the power from the career educationists in Washington and state capitals who dictate theoretical solutions to real problems. I like it. But then again, I've always kind of been into that whole fight the man thing.
I'm going back to a book that I read a couple summers ago called The Power of Their Ideas by Deborah Myers. And the assertion behind that text is that the people who are doing the work need to be the decision makers and need to formulate that vision and those dreams. So if you were to ask teachers if you could create a school that you'd want your own kid to go to, what would that look like? And then giving them the flexibility to create that school. So for me, educational reform isn't about any real model that you adopt and push down. I think it's creating the space for teachers to really push each other and dream up what could be, and giving them the space to experiment and play. And to me, that's going to go much, much further at changing education than any push-down mandate could ever do. I think there's one person in group of people that I've left out of this conversation that should be, and that's the students. Right? So what is the students' vision for their education, and how do we include that in the narrative and the dialogue?
You did it, Brian. This podcast, Wide Ruled, is all your fault. Brian and I met at an all-dudes jam fest in our friend Paul's mom's garage, and with a little bit of liquid courage, we overcame our social anxieties and started talking education reform. He introduced me to Grassroots, and now I'm hooked on figuring out what is going on with education in America. On Wide Ruled, I'll be digging into the past, present, and future of education in America, talking with educators, community members, and students. The episodes won't be sequential, though you may hear me refer back to previous episodes here and there. Wide Ruled is produced by myself as a part of Brain Root Light and Sound, where I work next to master cinematographer and avid listener Christopher Cook. By the way, at the time when I interviewed Brian for today's episode, he was a teacher leader, meaning he supervised and crafted curriculum for a handful of teachers in the Kansas City, Kansas school district. However, he has since stepped down from this position as teacher leader so that he is not a part of the educational bourgeoisie doing reform unto teachers. This fall, he will be back in the classroom, reforming himself to best serve his own students. Nice work, Brian. Thank you so much for listening. You can find out more about Wide Ruled and find links to some of the information cited in this episode at brainroot.tv/Wide Ruled, just like the Notebook. Thanks for making the world a better place.